Afternoon and welcome back at IMPAKT TV. Brief notice to the director. I'm hearing myself. Yeah. Yes. I'm not hearing myself again. That's good. All right. I would really like to introduce our next guest who is joining us from Canada. And that person is Paris Marx, who is tech critic, the author of the book Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation, and also the host and creator of Tech Won't Save Us podcast. He writes critically about cities and the tech industry. Please welcome Paris Marx.
Thanks so much for having me.
So where in Canada are you joining us from now?
So I'm in Newfoundland, which is on the east coast of Canada. Pretty much as close as you can get to Europe in Canada, but still quite a ways away.
All right, so you make a podcast, you're a writer, and in all of these different endeavors, you very much take a critical look at tech and big tech as well. Could you tell us a little bit more on how you got into this and also what your work focuses on?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been doing this writing for a while. I only started the podcast a little over 2 years ago. But I think what really got me into it, I was interested in technology when I was young. I used to code websites when I was younger. That was one of the ways I got into it. But then, around, I guess, the middle of the 2010s is when I really started taking a more critical look at what was going on with the tech industry. And in particular, that focused a lot on what was going on in cities and with transportation. And part of the reason for that was because I was seeing, the push for smart cities, particularly here in Canada with the Sidewalk Labs effort to build a smart city in Toronto. And then also, what Uber and these other kind of proposals for the future of transportation were going to look like in cities. And so I was really skeptical about what the real benefit of these were going to be. And so that is what helped to start to propel me down this more critical road when thinking about technology and the tech industry and the impacts that it's actually having on society. Because I think when you look at, smart city technology, it really hasn't played out in the way that we expected it to or the way that was promised to us. The same with proposals like Uber or autonomous vehicles that were supposed to, really improve our transportation system, upend the transportation system in a positive way, and have really been unable to fulfill those promises that they made to us. And so then, once I was looking into cities and what was going on in cities, I started to read more. I started to expand that perspective into the broader tech industry to look at what was going on there. And that's how, I guess I've developed this critical perspective over the past number of years.
Your podcast has the great name, I think, Tech Won't Save Us. It's a bold statement, I think, and it seems to very much directly, I'm not sure if it is, but oppose or form a response to what philosopher Morozov has also called this notion of tech solutionism, right? So this idea that technology can solve all of our problems and create this frictionless life almost. The festival theme, it's right behind me, is the course of smooth operations, right? This idea that technology can very much make our lives smooth. Why does tech not save us?
Oh, for many reasons, right? I think it's interesting what you say about the smooth operations, right? Because there's this idea of frictionlessness that is promoted by a lot of these tech companies, right? We want to make it so that you can engage in this commerce, so that you can do so many things without friction, as though that is just naturally a positive thing, right? We want to take out the friction of human interaction when we're buying things, when we're going to the grocery store and things like that. Is that really positive at the end of the day? Do we really want to lose those human connections? And so if we're thinking about, why tech won't save us, the podcast is really certainly, it's a provocative name, as a good podcast should have, I think. And the goal is not really to say that all technology is bad, that technology can serve no positive purpose in our lives or anything like that, right? The goal is really to look at what the tech industry as it is, put together right now is trying to do is, the impact that it's having on our world, and to see if that is positive. And I think, in many cases we can see that it's not. And so the goal is to say, when we look at the problems that we have in society that we really want to address, that we recognize need to be addressed, are those solutions going to come from just naturally developing new technologies and rolling new technologies out into the world? You know, this kind of technologically determinist view of how we solve these problems, one that's promoted by Silicon Valley and many tech companies. Or do we need to look at the politics of those problems, the reason why these problems emerged in the first place, and is actually dealing with those more fundamental, more foundational issues, really how we solve these things, rather than just hoping that new technologies are going to smooth over these political problems that we've created because of past policy choices.
So perhaps also sometimes asking the question, is there really a problem that needs solving? Because I feel sometimes these technologies, especially larger platforms, come with solutions of problems that we weren't even aware of having.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's quite common, I would say, right? Because one of the things that happens is that these people who are interested in technology, and rightfully so, I think it's cool to be excited about technology, but they work on something, they develop something new, and then the question is, how can we use this technology in society, right? How can we deploy it for some kind of ends? How can we use it, rather than, you know, approaching the problem from a different direction, right? From saying, what is the problem? You know, why is this a problem in the first place? How did it come to be? And in what ways can we solve this, right? What is required to actually ameliorate this social problem that we have? And can technology play a role in doing that? Rather than starting from, okay, we have this technology, now in what way can we use it? What way can we deploy it into the world? And then just assuming that, you know, because we have this technology, because we believe in the power of technology, that it's naturally going to make a problem better. And I think the experience that we have, especially over the past decade, but we could certainly go back further than that, is that just rolling out a technology does not necessarily solve these really deeply rooted problems.
All right, so there's an urgency I hear in this of working more critically with technology. And something, I mean, this very conversation is, of course, also enabled by technology. Your podcast can be listened to on big platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts. The time in which we live, like if one wants to be critical of technology, are you forced to be a hypocrite?
I don't think so, you know, and certainly this is kind of a point that gets made, certainly to me, as someone who is a critic of technology quite often. But I don't think that just because you use the technologies that, you know, exist in the world, that you can't also criticize the world as it is, right? It's like saying, you know, just because you exist in capitalism, because you buy things, you can never criticize the system as it works, right? Unfortunately, or you know, for better or worse, this is the society that we have. We have to live in it. We have to engage in our lives, but that doesn't mean that we can't work to try to improve the society, to ameliorate the society. And I think that should ultimately be our goal, right?
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree. I think it is really crucial to be able to think critically and also recognize that we're all part of this system, right? It's not, I don't think it's really realistic to think we can step outside of that, or that should be a reason that we cannot be critical anymore.
No, exactly.
So I'd like to talk a little bit more about your podcast, because you started it in the lockdown. And I think from some of the episodes that I've heard, this specific context also has been quite informative, or maybe exposed some of the power structures that need a more critical approach. How could you tell us a little bit more on like this context in which you started the podcast, and also how COVID has influenced your way of critiquing technology?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I started the podcast in April of 2020, so it was very early in the pandemic. You know, it was during that first kind of wave of lockdowns that we were experiencing. Over here, we locked down sometime in March, and then, you know, things started to reopen a bit by April. So I was able to go out and buy a podcast microphone, and you know, that's when I started the podcast. It was something I had wanted to do for a while before. But before the pandemic happened, I was on the road a lot. I was traveling a lot. So it seemed like a difficult proposition to, you know, have to figure out how to record these podcasts while I'm on the go. You know, it seemed like a more difficult thing to start, especially where I didn't really know what I was doing exactly. And so, yeah, so I started the podcast in the pandemic. I think it's gone quite well. And I think that the pandemic really showed us, how these tech companies can really benefit from having us all kind of trapped inside, you know, using their products more and more. We saw that as, you know, we were locked down, or even after the lockdowns when people didn't go out as much because there was the risk or the question of, if I go to this restaurant, if I go to this public space, will I accidentally, pick up COVID when I don't want to do that? And especially pre-vaccines, that was something that people were much more concerned about, though I would say it's still a concern right now, especially, as we're seeing new variants emerge and things like that. But during that time, we all kind of turned to our tech products, right? We were on social media platforms more. We were watching Netflix more. We were on video calls like this. And certainly it was great to be able to have those things during the pandemic. I think it would have made the pandemic much more difficult. And, that's not to say the pandemic is over, again, with that kind of framing. But we saw these companies' profits and their revenues soar during this period because we were all on our screens more. We were all looking at these products more, and that really shows us that the more that we have our eyeballs glued to these screens, looking at what these tech companies are doing, the more beneficial, the more they can make money off of us. And I think that's really instructive. And then the other piece of this as well is that at the same time, sure, a lot of kind of professional workers were able to stay home, didn't have to go out, had a lot of things delivered. But then there were also a lot of workers who, did have to go out and do those types of jobs, whether it's just at the grocery stores or the retail stores, the fast food outlets, the restaurants, or, the delivery workers who work for these apps who are delivering these things to our homes. And it really sets up a dichotomy between, the workers who could stay home, who could kind of insulate themselves from the worst of this pandemic, and then the people who were kind of outside, who were doing these jobs, who were at a much greater risk of contracting COVID as a result. And, I always think back to a story that Lauren Smiley wrote back in 2015. And I talked to her about it, where she described this shut-in economy. She had been outside of San Francisco for a while. She moved back into the city, and she said all of a sudden, there were all of these people who were depending on these on-demand services, these sharing economy services, quote unquote. Now we tend to call them gig economy services, but professional workers who were staying at home largely or going between home and work, but who were having everything delivered, all these services provided to them through these apps. And then what you really had was this class of people who were being served by these services, and then the class of servants who were kind of, existing around them, delivering all of these things that they needed. And it really showed this division that increasingly exists in our society. And it was one that I think we then saw kind of amplified and rolled out to many other parts of the world and societies and what have you during that stage of the pandemic. And I think we're going to see pieces of that kind of stick around.
Yeah, and I think also related to that, what you saw is that services like Uber Eats, or in the Netherlands we have these, it's called, flitsbezorgers, like gorillas, all these kind of services where you can order groceries and they come on the bike to get it to you. So these companies became huge in a very short period of time, but actually the ones gaining financially from that profit were not the workers, but the people owning those companies, right? Could you talk a little bit more on how these power inequalities are almost exploding in big tech, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you really see it across the tech sector, right? Where these companies are able to push down the rights, the wages of workers, whether it's at companies like Uber or these other kind of on-demand services, whether it's at a company like Amazon, where, they notably fight unionization, they fight efforts by their workers to improve their conditions. There are tons of stories about their workers having to pee in bottles, not being able to take bathroom breaks. Obviously Elon Musk is in the news a lot now, as he always is. But we know a lot about his Tesla factories, where workers are treated really terrible, where they're known for being incredibly racist, even sexist work environments as well. Similar things have been discussed at SpaceX as well, where women have spoken out about being treated in sexist manners by managers and things like that. So this is a really deep problem across the tech sector. It's something that we've known for a long time, but it's particularly concerning when you see the way that these tech companies are able to wield their power against workers so that they can benefit. And as you say, even with companies like Uber or like these, really quick delivery services that don't actually often make very much money, if any at all, but their investors do make money, especially at the moment when they can IPO, and then they can kind of cash out, right? Because they bought in at a much lower price. And so that is how they really get their benefit. I think the question now, as we're moving into this whole new environment, right, the tech sector as we know it really benefited from the cheap money, the low interest rates of the past 10 or so years, since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, around that period. Now we're seeing interest rates rise really significantly, right? And that's cutting off the cheap money that was really beneficial to a lot of these companies. And so now it's going to be interesting to see where things go from here, what the tech economy is going to look like. I think it's going to make much less sense for companies like Uber, who really thrived on that kind of model of just losing money for ages and delivering profits and benefits to investors through IPOs in the stock market. But then it's even hitting the major tech companies. Just in the past week or so, we saw continued declines for Meta, declines for Amazon, for Google, for Microsoft, all of these companies being hit, not Apple notably. But yeah, there's something huge happening in the tech economy right now, and it'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Do you have any expectations, speculations?
I don't know. I've kind of been predicting that Uber would finally go under for a while, and it hasn't happened. So I don't want to say it's finally going to happen now, because they've kind of defied the odds for so long. It looks like some of these micro mobility, scooter companies are really suffering. I don't really know what's going to happen to them in the future. I think they really have to change their model if they're going to go anywhere. Obviously major companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon, even though their stock prices are going down, like they're not going anywhere, right? They're kind of monoliths. They're monsters. They're institutions at this point. Certainly they are in the crosshairs of lawmakers for antitrust reasons and competition enforcement. But how far that goes, I think, really remains up in the air. It looks like, European regulators have been more open to taking some of those actions than in the United States. So we'll have to see how that develops. I think that one of the things that might impede some of those things from moving forward in the United States right now is the growing divide that they're creating with China, and the desire to kind of decouple from China and really suppress its tech economy. And I think that's really going to benefit a lot of the American tech giants, where they're going to be able to say, you really depend on us to ensure that the United States retains its technological dominance over China. So don't kind of mess with what exists right now, because if not, China might surpass us or something like that. And we've already seen growing ties between the U.S. tech industry and the U.S. government. The Secretary of State in the United States recently visited Silicon Valley again to talk to a lot of those companies. So I think that that's going to be something that we see more and more going forward, especially as they're growing kind of pressures on the revenue streams of some of these companies.
You already mentioned Elon Musk, and I think we have to talk about it a little bit more. Of course, he recently bought Twitter and already made a lot of changes that people have been constantly discussing about. How do you look at this development? What does it mean that this guy now owns Twitter, which is a really important also news source?
Yeah, it's it's been an interesting past week or so. It's been an interesting 6 months, I guess, as since he initially announced he was planning to take over this platform and buy Twitter. But I think the past week has been particularly troubling because there was always the question, when Elon Musk takes over this platform, what is that going to look like, right? What is he ultimately going to do with it? How is he going to act? Because he's obviously someone who posts a lot, who says a lot on Twitter, but was he going to moderate himself and really kind of act more responsible when he takes over this company? Obviously, what we've seen the past week is that he has no intention of doing something like that, right? And so I do think, listen, I'm someone who uses Twitter a lot, right? I'm certainly a power user on that platform. I don't use very much social media beyond that. And so, I think that there's a tendency a lot to kind of say negative things about Twitter to point out how much it sucks and how much time that we spend on it. But we've also, I think a lot of people who use it pretty often have made some really important connections on there, have communities that we've developed over the many years that we've been using the platform, and really enjoy it. And I think that there's a real threat to the things that make Twitter enjoyable and attractive to people as Elon Musk takes over and is making these changes. I think it's particularly concerning that he seems guided by a kind of notion of free speech that I think a lot of people would probably disagree with, more embracing of hate speech, more open toward hate speech being shared on the platform. And that's an issue in part because Twitter also has to make money, and advertisers don't like that as well. Twitter has signed up to kind of a code of conduct that it would be, more active about these things. And Elon Musk seems to be completely shredding that. I think that one of the concerns now is that Elon Musk doesn't seem to be able to take criticism in any way. He has had meetings with advertisers. He has had meetings with, various kind of stakeholder groups in the platform. And he's made very clear in his tweets that his response to those things is not positive, that he doesn't have much of a very clear vision for the platform, and that concerns people. And then based on the tweets that he's put out there, he doesn't seem to be a great person to be at the helm when he's sharing conspiracy theories about, U.S. politicians, the husband of the Speaker of the House being attacked last week. And then he shared a homophobic conspiracy theory about that and never apologized. And then he's made a habit of almost any time, one of these kind of extreme right-wing media figures replies to him, he tends to reply to them and kind of acknowledge the things that they're telling him about how Twitter should work, and how the real problem here is not the decisions that he's making, but how advertisers are being affected by like woke left advocates and things like this. And so it really shows that he's not taking it seriously, what is going to be necessary to improve this platform or make it a better place. And I think that, unfortunately, as much as I wouldn't like to see it happen, Twitter is probably looking like it's going downhill in the near future. And of course, it's not helped by the fact that he's planning to make changes to the verification system where you won't actually need to be verified anymore. You'll just be able to buy the badge. And that will be great for people who, try to scam on the platform and things like that. So there are a lot of questions about where it's going to go from here, but it doesn't look positive with how things are trending right now.
I think what this is also showing is the fact that platforms such as Twitter, they have become very important for the public. It's almost like a public infrastructure, right? At the same time, they are built upon commercial values that are not designed by governments. Could you imagine this being done in a different way? Do you think it would work if governments would start designing Twitter, for example, these kind of platforms?
Yeah, it's tough to say, right? I'm certainly someone who advocates a greater role for the public sector in technology. I think that one of the real mistakes that we have made, especially in North America, but I think in Europe to a large degree as well, is that we had this idea that technology and the internet and digital technologies in particular, and what kind of followed the privatization of the internet in the 1990s, was that technology and digital technology in particular was something that could only be done by the private sector, right? That we had to leave it to the private sector. We had this long history of understanding that there was a need for public sector institutions in many sectors of society, that they served an important role in especially in media, if you're thinking about public broadcast or public radio, and there's a very long history of these things, right? But then when the internet arrives, we're at this moment where kind of neoliberal ideology, really, this idea that we should leave more of society, more of the economy to the private sector, have less of a role for the state or the public sector in what is going on. And that this was going to be the way that we, improve society, that we increase prosperity and things like that. And that really took hold in the tech sector because it was something that really blew up as these ideas were being implemented. And there was, especially in the United States, there was a really strong relationship between some of the people pushing that ideology, that idea that the private sector should win out, and the tech industry itself, who is pushing these ideas that all we need to improve society is entrepreneurialism, is new technology, and things like that. And so I definitely think that there's a role for the government, for the public sector in taking these things on. What that actually looks like, I think, is more up in the air. And certainly, it's worth acknowledging that there's a lot of governments, like the US government right now, that probably don't seem very trustworthy when it comes to these things. So there's a question of how, we move the state in that direction where we can trust it to be engaged in these technological matters. So there are plenty of proposals around, cooperatives, whether the public sector or the government should be involved in funding technology cooperatives so that they can develop technologies that have quite a different vision from these more commercialized ones that we have today. But I think it's a discussion that we really need to start having if we want to see technology and digital technologies in particular be better oriented toward and better serve the public good and the needs of the wider society, rather than having to respond to commercial pressures all the time.
So we have people like Elon Musk taking over Twitter, but luckily, I would say there's also a lot of people working to deconstruct power structures to work against that. What are some of the hopeful initiatives that you think we should know about?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm often not as good as answering these questions because my focus is so much on criticism all the time, right? But I think it's been really hopeful in recent years to see how I feel like a lot of the tech industry has become more politicized and more engaged on these questions, right? We see a lot more tech workers organizing, whether it is outright unionization, as has happened in some tech companies, or just organizing to try to push their employers or the tech industry more broadly to pay more attention to particular important issues, right? Whether that is, forcing Amazon or Microsoft to be more active on the question of climate change and have better climate targets, whether it is pushing Google to drop contracts with the US Defense Department, other companies, I believe Amazon with the Immigration Enforcement Agency. There's growing push right now to get I believe it's Google to not be working with the Israeli military, as it kind of pushes on Palestinians and affects their rights and continues to oppress them. And so I think that this has been a really positive development, right? To see the tech workers, certainly, as I was saying, it's always cool to be interested in technology, to be engaged on technology, to want to see technology improve and improve society, but then also to see more of the people in the industry recognize that the tech and the tech companies that they work for don't always do these things. And they have an ability to push back on that from inside as well as from the outside, and to try to draw attention to what is actually going on at these companies, so that we can try to improve them and improve society at the end of the day.
Well, I think with that hopeful note, we have to, unfortunately, already finish our conversation. Thank you so much, Paris, for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you all for...
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.